April 18, 1943. The sea between Bougainville and New Ireland lay under a calm haze, the kind that made compasses seem slower and engines sound louder. On the flight decks of the carriers Suikaku, Shokaku, and Zuho, Japanese ground crews worked in silence broken only by the clatter of wrenches and the hiss of fuel lines. The morning air carried the smell of avgas and lacquered canvas. It was the scent of precision, discipline, and exhaustion. In the flag plot of the Zuikaku, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa studied the operation chart spread before him. 373 aircraft were ready: fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, the concentrated air strength of the remaining Japanese carrier fleet. Their target was the U.S. task force detected north of the Solomon Islands, a collection of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers guarding the advance toward Rabaul. The strike, he believed, could reverse the tide. "We will show them that the Imperial Navy still commands the Pacific," he told his air staff. No one disagreed. The plan was simple in its boldness. The strike force would launch in 4 waves: first, 0 fighters from the Zuikaku to sweep American air cover, then the Shokaku's D-3A dive bombers to cripple flight decks, followed by B-6N torpedo bombers from the Zuho, and finally a reserve of fighters to suppress survivors and escort the return. Ozawa's staff called it Operation Igo Kai no An, the second phase of Admiral Yamamoto's offensive designed to cripple Allied naval strength. But beneath the confidence lay unease. Japan's carrier air groups were no longer the elite corps of 1942. Training hours had been cut by half, replacement pilots barely logged 50 carrier landings before combat. Many had never seen battle. In the hangar decks, flight leaders offered hurried briefings: attack altitude, target priority, fuel limits, while mechanics marked tail numbers in chalk to track which aircraft could be salvaged after the mission. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." By contrast, across hundreds of miles of open ocean, the American fleet was already alert. Naval intelligence in Pearl Harbor, working with intercepts from the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, had decrypted fragments of Japanese transmissions referencing Operation Igo. The name alone was enough to trigger alarm. At Henderson Field and on Guadalcanal's new satellite strips, P-38 Lightnings and F-4U Corsairs were loaded with ammunition and extra drop tanks. 13 Fighter Command had been tracking fuel usage and weather reports since dawn. The Americans did not know when the attack would come, but they knew it would. At 0430 hours, the first carrier engines roared to life. Sailors crouched along the flight deck, hands shielding their faces from the exhaust blast. Signal flags rose and fell. Propellers blurred. The first Zero lifted into the gray dawn, wheels tucking beneath its fuselage as it disappeared into the east. One after another, aircraft followed, 373 in total, filling the morning sky with parallel contrails that gleamed silver against the rising sun. From the Zuikaku's bridge, Ozawa watched the stream of planes and whispered to his flag lieutenant, "The fate of the Empire is in the air today." Far below, in the ready rooms of the American carriers Essex and Yorktown, radar operators began to pick up faint contacts, first as static, then as a growing mass of moving echoes. The Pacific, silent moments before, had become a theater of approaching inevitability. Pilots strapped in, engines coughed to life, and carrier decks shifted from calm efficiency to violent purpose. In Tokyo, staff officers at the Imperial Navy's Air Bureau awaited coded reports of victory. Few imagined how swiftly the numbers would invert, that by dusk, of the 373 aircraft that had risen from Japanese decks, barely 70 would return. For now, there was only the bright promise of motion, the roar of engines, and the illusion that the Empire's reach still matched its ambition. The success of the coming battle was decided long before the first Zero left its carrier deck. In the cool corridors of Pearl Harbor's underground intelligence center, the radio operators of Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known only by the sterile acronym FRUPAC, had already traced the outlines of the Japanese plan. Since late March 1943, Japanese carriers operating from Truk and Rabaul had been sending coded situation reports, describing fuel shortages, rendezvous points, and pilot rosters. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25D cipher only partially, but that was enough. Certain words, IGO, Bougainville, carrier strike, appeared again and again in the decrypts. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, one of FRUPAC's chief analysts, summarized the pattern in his April 14 memo: enemy intends mass carrier-based air operation towards Solomons within the next week. All available aircraft committed. Objective appears to be destruction of U.S. fleet elements supporting New Georgia operations. Admiral Halsey's staff, reading the summary, moved instantly. Radar pickets were established along the northern approaches, destroyers were repositioned to relay contact reports, and the 339th Fighter Squadron, veterans of the South Pacific's air defense grid, were ordered to maximum readiness at Guadalcanal. The Americans had learned from blood and loss. In 1942, they had been surprised at Coral Sea, struck at Midway, and battered in the eastern Solomons. But by 1943, the lessons of electronic warfare, radar coordination, and centralized command were integrated into the fleet's reflexes. 13 Fighter Command's April 16 operations order, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, reads like an early blueprint for modern air defense: all radar stations to report contacts in 5-minute intervals. Fighter control to coordinate interception by vectoring Lightning flights in pairs. Altitude advantage mandatory. Preserve formation integrity. Conserve fuel. On the morning of April 18, radar screens at Guadalcanal's Fighter Direction Center flickered to life with a wide, amorphous smear of contacts north of Bougainville. The operator, Sergeant James Drexler, logged the first definite range reading at 0912 hours, distance 210 miles, bearing 358 degrees, altitude 10,000 feet. Within minutes, the signal intensified. The Japanese strike force was inbound. "That's not a raid," Drexler muttered to his controller. "That's an air migration." Colonel Edwin House, commanding 13 Fighter Command, issued a single directive: intercept and destroy. Over 150 American fighters were scrambled from Henderson Field, Munda, and Russell's, Lockheed P-38 Lightnings with twin engines gleaming under the sun, Corsairs from Marine squadrons, and a handful of P-40 Warhawks used for low-altitude cover. Fuel trucks hissed along the taxiways as armorers slammed .50 caliber belts into wing bays. What followed was not a spontaneous defense but a calculated ambush. U.S. Navy Task Force 58 had deliberately broadcast false position reports, luring the Japanese to a phantom fleet northeast of the Solomons. The real American carriers, including Essex and Yorktown, remained several hundred miles to the south, ready to recover fighters once the enemy was drawn into range. The plan had been approved 2 days earlier by Admiral Halsey himself: let them come. When they do, every man in the South Pacific will know it. By 0930 hours, the first squadrons of the 339th were airborne, their drop tanks filled to the last gallon. Captain Thomas Lanfear, veteran of earlier Guadalcanal interceptions, led the first flight northward. His P-38's twin booms shimmered like polished silver in the sunlight as he climbed toward 20,000 feet. Below, the sea stretched unbroken, no ships, no smoke, just the empty blue horizon that had trapped so many pilots in its deceptive calm. At 1010 hours, the radar blips multiplied into a dense wave, the full Japanese strike group. The interceptors split into altitude tiers, one formation to engage the escorts, another to dive on the bombers. The control officer's voice crackled through the radio net: multiple bogies inbound, estimated 350 plus. This is it, boys. Make it count. As the Lightnings accelerated into position, American radar operators continued feeding vectors with mechanical comm. Every bearing, every altitude report was precise. The system worked as intended, a synchronized orchestra of metal, mathematics, and human nerve. The trap was set. By 1030 hours, 373 Japanese carrier planes were flying straight into a sky that was already waiting for them. At 1037 hours, the first American formations sighted the enemy, tiny glints far ahead against the blinding Pacific haze. Captain Thomas Lanphier of the 339th Fighter Squadron called it out on the radio: "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 20. A second later, his wingman, Lieutenant Rex Barber, confirmed, "Looks like a whole damn Air Force." Through their gun sights, the Americans saw them clearly now: rows upon rows of aircraft, Zero fighters in the lead, followed by D-3A dive bombers and B-6N torpedo planes glinting under the sun. They were flying tight and steady, disciplined to the last, each formation in textbook order. The Japanese air doctrine prized order, even beauty, in formation. But beauty was a liability in a sky thick with radar-guided interceptors. Lanphier nosed down his P-38 Lightning and pushed the throttle to full. The twin Allison engines howled. "Tally-ho," he barked. Behind him, a dozen P-38s peeled into attack formation, sunlight flashing off their wings like the blades of scythes. The Japanese didn't see them at first. They were climbing into the wind, focused on their supposed American carrier targets to the south. When the first tracers cut across the formation, panic rippled through the lead group. Lieutenant Toshio Matsuda, flying a D-3A dive bomber, later recalled in his interrogation after the war, "It was as if the air turned into fire." The sky itself opened. Lanphier's guns stitched across the lead bomber's fuselage. The D-3A broke apart midair, its right wing shearing away in a spray of fuel. A second later, Barber's Lightning flamed another from behind, sending it spiraling downward into the sea. Within the first minute, 5 Japanese planes were burning. The Zeros reacted swiftly. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Okuyama, snapped orders over the radio: "All fighters engage interceptors. Protect the bombers." He and his wingmen swung out of formation and climbed to meet the Americans. What followed was chaos in pure form: planes twisting and diving through vapor trails, sunlight flashing on canopies, tracers burning through cloud wisps. The Lightning pilots relied on speed, diving in pairs, striking once, then zooming clear. The Zeros, lighter and more maneuverable, turned sharply to counter, but they could not catch the twin-engine fighters in a dive. Lanphier later wrote in his after-action report, "Enemy attempted to turn inside, but we maintained altitude advantage." Numerous kills observed within first 10 minutes. Below them, the second American group, Marine Corsairs from VMF 124, entered the melee. Their gull-winged silhouettes slashed across the bomber streams, .50 caliber guns blazing. "It was like shooting through a swarm of angry hornets," recalled Lieutenant Bob McClure, who downed 2 torpedo planes in under 30 seconds. By 1100 hours, the Japanese strike formation had ceased to exist as a single unit. What had left the carriers in perfect discipline was now a broken lattice of individual duels. Pilots fought blind in smoke and sunlight, radios filled with half-shouted bearings and dying signals. From the American side, the coordination remained ruthless. Ground controllers at Guadalcanal fed constant updates, guiding interceptors toward retreating bombers. They were being hunted, McClure said years later. Every time a group tried to pull out, there were lightnings waiting for them. The Japanese pilots fought with desperation and courage. Some continued their dive runs even after taking hits, aiming for the imagined location of the U.S. carriers. A few even dropped their ordnance blindly into the sea. But most never reached attack altitude. At 1,135 hours, with fuel running low and losses mounting, the surviving Japanese fighters tried to break contact. The sea below was dotted with burning wrecks and oil slicks. The Americans pursued only as long as fuel allowed, discipline over vengeance. By noon, the battle was over. Radar screens that had once shown hundreds of contacts now showed only scattered echoes. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched that morning, more than 300 had been destroyed or lost. The ocean below shimmered with wreckage and flame, a graveyard of aluminum and ambition. In the command post at Guadalcanal, Colonel House received the final report. "Enemy strike repulsed," it read. "Airspace secured. Victory total, overwhelming." For the first time in the Pacific War, the Imperial Navy's carrier arm had been broken not by ships or bombs, but by airmen waiting for them in the sky. By the time the last American fighters returned to base, the Pacific sky had gone strangely quiet. The battle had lasted less than 90 minutes, but in that short span the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered its most catastrophic air loss since Midway. What had begun as an ambitious strike, 373 aircraft strong, ended as a massacre. At 1,210 hours, radar plots confirmed what the pilots already knew: the enemy was gone. Only faint traces remained, isolated returns limping north toward Bougainville, a few broken signals from Japanese radios fading into static. The ocean below was littered with oil slicks, floating debris, and life rafts burning themselves out under the tropical sun. On the flight decks of the Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuho, flight directors stared toward the southern horizon, waiting for aircraft that would never return. By mid-afternoon, the carriers began receiving scattered distress calls, fragmented Morse, short bursts of voice transmissions, cries for bearings and rescue. One message, later recovered from Japanese naval archives, read simply, "Out of fuel. Engine damaged. Tell mother I did my duty." It was the last transmission from Lieutenant Okuyama's Zero flight. Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of Zuikaku, expression rigid. Around him, flight crews prepared recovery operations, but there were few planes left to recover. At 1,530 hours, the first survivors began to appear, single aircraft limping in with holes punched through their wings, landing gear jammed, paint scorched black by tracer fire. A handful managed to land. Most ditched within sight of the carrier groups. Ozawa ordered destroyers to rescue what they could. Even then, sharks and distance claimed more lives than the Americans did. Of the 373 aircraft launched that morning, only 71 returned. Less than 20 were combat capable. Among the dead were some of Japan's last veteran carrier aviators, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. Their loss crippled not just the carrier's air strength but also the training infrastructure that had kept replacements alive. On the American side, the scale of victory stunned even the commanders. 13 Fighter Command reported 297 confirmed kills, with an additional 24 probable and 12 damaged. Pilot losses were light, only 6 aircraft failed to return, most due to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion. When Colonel House transmitted the final summary to Admiral Halsey, his message was brief: enemy air arm decimated. Sky secure. In the aftermath, wreckage drifted for miles. U.S. reconnaissance aircraft photographed the sea strewn with floating wings, fuselage sections, and oil fires. Later analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed the total: 302 aircraft destroyed, 58 more written off after forced landings. Japanese rescue ships recovered only 68 pilots out of more than 600 aircrew who had launched. For the Americans stationed at Henderson Field, the returning fighters were greeted not with cheers but with silence and disbelief. Ground crews counted the bullet holes in wings, the empty ammo belts, the streaks of salt where sea spray had dried on the fuselages. Pilots climbed out of their cockpits exhausted, many too numb to celebrate. "We didn't feel like victors," Lieutenant Barber recalled later. "We felt like witnesses to something ending." In Tokyo, the news was delayed for days. Initial reports from Rabaul claimed tactical success, citing exaggerated figures of American losses. But when the carriers docked at Truk and their flight decks were found nearly empty, the truth could no longer be disguised. Ozawa's official report to the Naval General Staff, recovered in the post-war archives, contained a single devastating line: enemy interception total and precise. Carrier air arm rendered ineffective for the immediate future. The battle marked a turning point. After April 18, 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again mounted a massed carrier airstrike in the South Pacific. The once proud fleet that had dominated the early war years was now a hollow instrument, its decks quiet, its pilots gone. For the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, it was another mission completed. For Japan's naval air arm, it was the day the sky fell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the days following the disaster, American reconnaissance flights swept across the northern Solomons, photographing wreckage still burning on remote beaches and atolls. Pieces of aircraft washed ashore on Bougainville, some with markings still legible, rising suns on twisted aluminum, tail numbers stenciled in red. These images were transmitted to Pearl Harbor, where intelligence officers began compiling the first full assessment of the engagement. Within a week, it was clear the Americans had achieved something more than a tactical victory. They had effectively erased the remaining offensive air arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yet for intelligence officers at 13 Fighter Command and the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, the greater story lay in how it had happened, how, through timing, deception, and technological precision, a numerically inferior force had annihilated one of the last Japanese carrier strikes. On April 23, 1943, Colonel Edwin House submitted his formal after-action report to Admiral Halsey. It ran 15 pages, dense with coordinates, radar logs, and gun camera analysis. Enemy formations maintained strict discipline at approach, House wrote, but no radio coordination evident during engagement. Radar control and altitude advantage decisive. Recommend expansion of current fighter direction networks to all forward bases. The report was later used as a model for fleet-wide air defense doctrine, and by 1944, every major U.S. carrier group operated under a near-identical radar interception system. Simultaneously, captured Japanese communications from Rabaul began to reach Allied intelligence centers in Melbourne and Hawaii. These included fragments of the 4th Air Group's war diary, recovered months later from abandoned installations in the Bismarck Archipelago. The entries were terse, almost clinical. April 18, departed truck at 0400. Launch successful. Contact lost. Communication intermittent. No aircraft returned from strike unit. Estimated total loss. In the margins, a surviving officer had scribbled, "We have no more men to train." By mid-1944, interrogations of captured Japanese aviators and staff officers filled in the human dimension. Lieutenant Toshio Matsuda, who had survived a crash landing on Bougainville and was captured months later, described the psychological collapse of the strike. "We thought we had surprise," he told interrogators from the Allied translator and interpreter section, ATIS. "But when we reached the coast, they were already waiting above us. Every direction we turned, there were lightnings." Another survivor, Ensign Keiji Ida, explained the breakdown in communication. "Our radios were poor. When the first planes were attacked, everyone began transmitting at once. No one could hear the command frequency. I saw many of our bombers collide trying to evade." His statement corroborated U.S. debriefings that recorded multiple mid-air collisions among Japanese aircraft in the confusion of battle. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey summarized the engagement's consequences bluntly. The April 1943 carrier strike was the final major offensive action attempted by the Japanese Naval Air Arm in the South Pacific. Its failure ended the threat of long-range carrier raids against Allied fleet concentrations. In Tokyo, the loss sent shockwaves through the Naval General Staff. Records from the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium reveal that surviving officers, including Ozawa's operations chief, later admitted the operation's flaws. "We underestimated radar," said Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's leading air strategists. "We assumed interception could not be coordinated so precisely. It was not our pilots who failed, it was our understanding of the new form of war." For U.S. analysts, those words confirmed what the battle had already proven, that air warfare had entered an age of detection, computation, and command. Skill and courage still mattered, but without information, they were meaningless. By 1945, fragments of the Japanese war diaries and interrogation notes were compiled into a classified report by the Air Force Historical Research Agency. It concluded, the decimation of the Japanese carrier strike on April 18, 1943, represents a transition in air power, where the advantage no longer lies with the attacker but with the defender who controls the unseen. For the men of 13 Fighter Command, those words were distant abstractions. They remembered only the fire, the chaos, the smell of burning oil. For intelligence officers, however, that day marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where victory was measured not in dogfights, but in signals, timing, and the quiet hum of radar screens long before the shooting began. The shockwaves from April 18, 1943, spread faster than any aircraft. By the end of the month, reports of the debacle had reached both capitals, Tokyo and Washington, though each received them through very different filters. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters convened an emergency session on April 27. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and denial. Vice Admiral Ozawa's telegraph report, transmitted from truck, had been carefully worded to preserve dignity. Phrases like unexpected interception and heavy enemy radar advantage softened the truth. But the numbers were undeniable. Only 71 aircraft returned, fewer than 20 were operational. Of 606 aviators launched, 539 were dead or missing. Fleet Admiral Manichi Koga, who had succeeded Yamamoto after his death days earlier, received the figures in silence. He read them twice before setting the paper down. "This," he said, "is the end of our offensive air." The sentence was not hyperbole. In a single morning, Japan had lost its last experienced carrier pilots. No replacement program, no reserve squadrons could fill that void. Behind the closed doors of the Navy Ministry, the tone shifted from disbelief to recrimination. Some blamed Ozawa for misjudging American strength, others faulted Genda's planning staff for insisting on concentrated, high-altitude formations. The few surviving pilots were questioned harshly by staff officers desperate to explain the inexplicable. One survivor recalled being asked if American fighters had new weapons or invisible armor. Another said the debriefing felt more like an inquisition than a report. Outside those rooms, public silence prevailed. Newspapers made no mention of the battle. Instead, the Yomiuri Shimbun carried a front-page story about fierce enemy losses north of the Solomons. The Imperial Navy Information Bureau released a statement claiming 40 American planes destroyed in decisive action. In reality, U.S. losses numbered 6. The truth would remain buried until after the war. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the mood in Washington was one of restrained triumph. Admiral Ernest King received the first after-action summaries from Halsey's command on April 25. His aide recorded the admiral's reaction in a single line. King nodded once. Said nothing. The implications were already clear to him. Japan's carrier threat, the weapon that had defined the early war, was gone. At the Navy Department, analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Air Staff compiled charts comparing the April strike to Midway. The numbers astonished even the most hardened strategists. In less than 2 years, one report concluded, the Imperial Navy's offensive air strength has been reduced from over 1,500 carrier-based aircraft to fewer than 200. Another noted that Japan's pilot training pipeline, already strained by fuel shortages, would require at least 2 years to recover, time it no longer had. President Franklin Roosevelt was briefed on May 2. His naval aide, Captain John Bertel, summarized the encounter in his diary, Pacific situation improving rapidly. Halsey's airmen achieved near-total destruction of enemy strike. President pleased but cautions against overconfidence. Roosevelt reportedly remarked, they will fight harder when cornered, but they are cornered. The victory also had strategic consequences. With the Japanese carrier arm crippled, U.S. planners accelerated Operation Cartwheel, the encirclement of Rabaul. Airfields once considered vulnerable were now secure. Navy and Army Air Force staff projected that the next offensive could proceed without fear of large-scale carrier counterattacks. The skies over the Solomons belonged to the Allies. In Tokyo, the consequences were existential. The Naval Air Bureau quietly disbanded several squadrons, merging their remnants into training units. Fuel rations were cut further, flight hours for cadets dropped to less than 20 per month. Senior officers spoke openly, in private, of the air famine. Admiral Ozawa, despite the disaster, was not relieved. There were too few senior officers left to replace him. But his carrier task force was effectively grounded. By summer, the Imperial Japanese Navy still held its great ships, the Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuho, but they were carriers in name only. Their decks were bare, their hangars empty, their once proud squadrons reduced to ghosts. In Washington, the Naval Intelligence Bulletin for July 1943 carried a final assessment: enemy carrier-based aviation has ceased to be an effective striking arm. The Pacific Initiative now rests permanently with Allied forces. And so it did. From that spring onward, every island captured, every convoy sailed, every bomber launched across the Pacific moved under a new sky, one uncontested, one earned through intelligence, discipline, and the ruin of an empire's last gamble. The numbers told one story, the men who lived through it told another. For the airmen on both sides, April 18, 1943, was not simply a date or a statistic, it was a day that defined the rest of their lives. At Henderson Field, the surviving American pilots gathered in the mess that evening, too drained to celebrate. Their flight suits were soaked with sweat and oil, their faces streaked with exhaust grime. The ground crews had lined up mugs of coffee and tin plates of cold rations, but few ate. Captain Thomas Lanphier sat at a folding table, silent, his flight logbook open but blank. His P-38, Miss Virginia II, bore 14 bullet holes, one through the wing root just inches from the fuel tank. He had survived again, but the elation was gone. "We saw them burning in the water," he said later. "You don't feel victory looking down on that." Lieutenant Rex Barber, his wingman, remembered the strange stillness after landing. "You come back and the engines stop, and the noise in your head keeps going. You think of the ones who didn't make it, on both sides." Years later, in interviews for the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion, Barber described how the sheer scale of destruction changed him. There was nothing heroic about it. It was slaughter in the sky. We did our duty, but it didn't feel like war anymore, it felt like extinction. For the Japanese airmen, the ordeal was even more brutal. Survivors of the downed carrier groups washed ashore along the coasts of Bougainville and New Ireland for weeks afterward. Many were never recovered. Allied coast watchers later recorded faint cries for help carried over the surf at night, voices that faded with the tide. Those who did survive faced capture or starvation. Lieutenant Toshio Matsuda, who had ditched his burning D-3A near Empress Augusta Bay, crawled inland with a broken arm. He was found days later by natives loyal to the Allies and turned over to an Australian patrol. When interrogated months later, he wept while describing the sight of his squadron disintegrating. "We flew in perfect order," he said, "and then we were smoke. I could see my leader burning. He did not even try to escape the fire." Japanese rescue destroyers spent days combing the sea. The Hamakaze recovered fewer than 30 men. By the time the search was called off, fuel and morale were both exhausted. One report from the Zuikaku's medical officer noted, "Those who returned could not speak. Their eyes moved but did not see." Back at Truk, the atmosphere was one of quiet mourning. Pilots who had lost their comrades placed folded headbands, hachimaki, on the altar at the base shrine. The hangars were silent, filled only with the smell of spilled fuel and paint. Chief Petty Officer Hideo Sato, one of the few surviving maintenance officers, wrote in his diary, later recovered by U.S. investigators, "The sea has taken all our brothers. The sky no longer answers when we call." On the American side, memorials were brief and understated. 6 U.S. pilots had not returned, 3 from combat damage, 3 from running out of fuel over the open ocean. Their names were painted on a piece of plywood outside the 339th Squadron tent. No speeches were made. Instead, mechanics set about repairing planes for the next patrol. "We couldn't think about it," said Sergeant Bill Everett, a crew chief. "You just kept working. That was how you stayed sane." In the years after the war, when historians and veterans met again, the emotions resurfaced. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, former adversaries shook hands for the first time. Among them was Commander Genda, the architect of Japan's carrier strategy, and several surviving American pilots from the South Pacific Campaign. Genda reportedly bowed and said, "Our young men fought bravely. Yours did too. But they died believing in a world that was already gone." The human cost of that day was not measured in aircraft or tonnage but in the silence that followed. Thousands of men had launched into the Pacific sky, carrying the hopes of 2 empires. When the smoke cleared, only the sea remained, vast, indifferent, and filled with the ghosts of those who had flown too far. In the decades that followed, historians came to see April 18, 1943, as a dividing line, a point where air warfare ceased to be an art of daring and became an exercise in coordination, intelligence, and industrial reach. The battle had not only annihilated Japan's last major carrier strike force but had demonstrated something far more consequential, that the United States had learned how to control the air not through numbers alone, but through systems, radar networks, signal intelligence, and logistical precision that could project power across thousands of miles. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces immediately studied the engagement. Reports from the Air Force Historical Research Agency and 13 Fighter Command became required reading in pilot schools by late 1943. Diagrams of the interception, showing the P-38's vectoring into converging altitude bands, were used to teach defense in-depth air tactics. Admiral Halsey, reviewing Colonel House's after-action summary, wrote in the margin, "This is the new form of naval warfare, fought not by fleets, but by frequencies." From that point forward, the Pacific Campaign evolved around the lessons learned that day. Radar stations were expanded from Guadalcanal to the Gilberts. Fighter control was centralized under trained directors who could plot hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. The result was the seamless command structure that would later defend the invasion of the Marianas and repel Japan's final air offensives. For Japan, the consequences were catastrophic and irreversible. Post-war analysis of captured Imperial Navy records revealed that the loss of 300 carrier-trained airmen in a single day was more than just an operational setback, it was a terminal wound. The replacement system, already strained by fuel shortages and the disintegration of flight schools, never recovered. The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary recorded, with chilling brevity, "No further operations possible. Units to reconstitute ashore." At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, retired Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome admitted, "That day, the war turned in the air. We had spent 20 years building our naval air arm, and in one afternoon it was destroyed, not just the planes, but the men, the spirit, the doctrine." His words echoed the reflections of his American counterparts, who saw in Japan's collapse the inevitable outcome of a contest between ideology and industry. The broader historical significance lay in how the victory had been achieved. It was not through overwhelming numbers or surprise, but through mastery of logistics and communication. Every element, from radar stations on Guadalcanal to Liberty ships ferrying aviation fuel across the Pacific, had been part of a single interconnected system. The same industrial capacity that produced 10,000 P-38 Lightnings also produced the radar scopes, the fuel drums, the radio crystals that made precision interception possible. In the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, surviving pilots from both sides gathered to commemorate the battle's anniversary. Photographs from the event show former enemies standing shoulder to shoulder beside restored aircraft. Colonel Rex Barber, by then in his 60s, spoke quietly, "We didn't win because we were better men. We won because we were backed by a nation that could build and supply endlessly." That's what decided the sky. The transformation in military thought extended beyond the Pacific. The U.S. Strategic Air Command, formed in the post-war years, drew heavily on the doctrine of detection and coordination pioneered in 1943. In lectures at Maxwell Air Force Base, instructors cited the April battle as the birth of integrated air defense. The principle that control of the electromagnetic spectrum was as vital as control of the sky became central to Cold War strategy. Yet, beneath the analysis and the doctrine, there remained a human memory. The men who flew that day never forgot the sight of the Pacific dotted with burning aircraft, tiny specks of fire vanishing into the sea. For them, victory had come at the price of witnessing an entire generation of aviators erased in minutes. Today, fragments of those aircraft rest in museums and seabeds across the Pacific. At the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a P-38 Lightning bearing the scars of combat sits beneath soft lights, its aluminum skin reflecting the quiet hum of visitors passing by. Nearby, an exhibit panel reads, "On April 18, 1943, 373 Japanese aircraft launched from carriers to strike the U.S. fleet. More than 300 were shot down. The battle marked the end of Japan's carrier air power and the dawn of information warfare. The war moved on, but that single day endured, a day when the Pacific sky changed forever. It was the moment when radar replaced instinct, when calculation replaced chance, and when the empire built on faith and destiny confronted a nation built on production and precision. In the end, April 18th was not remembered for the fire or the wreckage, but for what it revealed, that in modern war, knowledge was the greatest weapon of all. The battle where hundreds of planes fell blazing into the sea became the quiet beginning of an age where victory would be measured not by courage alone, but by the ability to see, and strike, first.